This book is an effort to focus on the solutions to the climate crisis. An Inconvenient Truth was devoted almost 90% to a description of the crisis, its causes, and its consequences, with about 10% giving an overview of the solutions. This book is almost exactly the inverse. Virtually all of it is focused on the solutions to the climate crisis. And during the 3 years it took me to write this book, I engaged in a lot of in-depth research, some of it here in this city, but also in cities around the world, meeting with scientists and technologists, engineers and entrepreneurs. More than 30 so-called solution summits attended by the leading experts from around the world on all of the important solutions that must be included in a comprehensive plan to actually solve the climate crisis. The good and hopeful news that I learned in that 3-year effort was that we have more than enough solutions to solve 3 or 4 climate crises. And the good news further is that we only have to solve 1. But we have everything we need, with the exception of the will to act, which is still in formation. One of the chapters toward the end of this book deals with what the neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists have learned about the way we think about crises like this one. There is no crisis like this one. It is unique in its capacity to end human civilization as we know it. It is global in scale. But our way of thinking has been inherited from our ancestors. And now, is it safe to talk about evolution in this? We had another trial in my home state. It didn't turn out well. But the kinds of threats our ancestors survived, snakes, spiders, big cats with claws, other humans with weapons, these are the kinds of threats that trigger an immediate, visceral, and automatic response. If a snake were to slither across this carpet down the aisle, you wouldn't debate what the implications were. These 2 rows would just clear out almost immediately. But when a much more serious threat, global in scale, requires us to use our reasoning capacity to discern it and to form an effective response, that is not an automatic response. But we do have the capacity to respond. We have demonstrated it many times in the past. The great generation, the greatest generation as it's called, that won World War II, confronted the incipient threats in the aftermath of that war, surveyed the chaos in Europe and Asia, and created the Marshall Plan and the United Nations and a variety of global institutions and global responses, many of them American-led, most of them American-led, that defuse many of those threats. Europe is now unified, peaceful, and prosperous, partly as a result of a multi-decade effort that was begun with foresight in that era. The great cathedrals of Europe in an earlier age were built over more than a century by multiple generations who formed a long-term goal based on their deepest values and stayed on course. So we know that we have that capacity, but we have to awaken it and we have to choose to take a new path. Why? Because as the first chapter in this book, well, let me begin with the introduction. The introduction just sketches out the nature of the crisis and the role played by our manner of thinking and reasoning together to address the crisis. As librarians, and I know not all of you are librarians, but librarians and those who are part of this organization are stewards of a great institution that was born in the Enlightenment, which came out of the new information ecosystem created by the printing press in the middle of the 15th century. From the fall of Rome to the Enlightenment, information was monopolized by elites. Libraries in those centuries often had a dozen or a few dozen books chained to the desk, written in a language that less than 1% of the people understood. Only when the printing press democratized knowledge and spread access to knowledge that had been reserved for elites did a new information ecosystem emerge. And it was characterized by a meritocracy of ideas, the relative value of which was determined in large part by a process by which all of the literate went through a process that the computer scientists would call massively parallel processing, much in the manner of a Google search. The ideas that attracted the most attention and endured, having been tested by so many people, rose to the top. And a new source of sovereign authority displaced the monarchs and the medieval church. And the new sovereign was the rule of reason. And that served us so well that people were emboldened to create new institutions, including libraries, including public libraries, including representative democracy, where decisions could be made according to the rule of reason. We sometimes take for granted the extent to which the founders of America, so many of them from this city and this region, lived in a world of print. It was the dominant medium by far. The book, the pamphlet, the hymnal, the Bible, the ancient classic texts. And then the medium of broadcasting began to displace the medium of print. And because of its technological characteristics, we saw a refeudalization of the information ecosystem. And I get into this partly because in the introduction to this book, I connect that to some of the prevailing confusion about whether or not there is a relevant controversy about the science of global warming. There has been a determined effort to create false controversy about well-established facts. It's not the first time that's happened. In the 1960s, when the Surgeon General's report conveyed to people the medical consensus linking the smoking of cigarettes to diseases of the heart and arteries and lungs, the tobacco companies, many of them, engaged in an effort whereby they hired actors and dressed them up as doctors and told them to look into the camera and say, smoking is good for you. There's no medical evidence showing otherwise.